Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May is in Hamburg for the meeting of world leaders at the G20 summit. It's the first time Donald Trump has met the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and the agenda will focus on trade, climate change and global terrorism. Speaking to the BBC this morning, Theresa May said she was hoping to push the international community to clamp down further on terrorist financing.
What I'm doing here at the G20 is raising the need for us to work collectively, internationally, to deal with terrorist financing, not just large sums of money that are financing terrorism, but also to find ways of working with the financial services, with banks and others, to identify those smaller scale transactions that can sometimes lead to terrorist activity.
Theresa May. Well, let's get the latest from Hamburg and talk to our deputy political editor, John Pienaar. So that's her push, her campaign, if you like, to get agreement on trying to fight back on terrorism globally. What else is she talking about?
Well, as you say, that's the message of the morning, to get countries to agree to do more practically and politically to deal with the sourcing of finance to terrorism. You wouldn't expect a huge row about the principle of that. You'd expect it to appear in some sort of agreed form in the final communique. There's much else on the agenda, though. She'll be meeting Donald Trump in the course of this summit, also meeting the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping. And those will be interesting, fascinating meetings, especially with Donald Trump, because Theresa May is one of many leaders here who want Donald Trump to rethink on all sorts of things, notably the climate change agreement that was agreed in Paris. And she was speaking to me earlier on, saying she hoped that he could be persuaded to change his mind and come back aboard with that Paris climate change deal. Not easy to see how that might be accomplished, but there was Theresa May saying she was taking on these challenges. And Joe, it's worth pointing out that as this list of global challenges grow, whether it's climate change, whether it's North Korea, whether it's disagreements about trade, it's arguably a problem for Britain and for Theresa May that the influence of the UK could be said to be shrinking in the aftermath of the Brexit vote and after the election, where Theresa May's authority has diminished and not increased as she so much hoped before the vote.
Right, well, that was my next question, John Pienaar. How much impact can she and the UK really have in this particular forum, bearing in mind the result of the election?
Well, I mean, she's here, she's presenting and promoting the idea of a global Britain, as she puts it, reaching out to the world, engaging in big international problems. But there's no denying there is an issue there. There is a problem there. Her former cabinet colleague William Hague was saying there's a problem with Britain losing influence as a result of Brexit. She says she's going to not be timid, she's going to be bold. But that in itself is a recognition that she has a challenge on her hands.
John Pienaar in Hamburg, thank you very much. Paul Ward, this is really about the meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. What do you expect?
Well, what's interesting about G20s is that they're supposed to be about alliance building, about diplomacy. They're not the sort of language that actually Donald Trump specialises in, let's be honest. But when it comes to Putin in particular, obviously back home, Trump's got a big problem with this perception that his campaign was too close to the Kremlin, that people around him were too close to it. So he's got a tricky task today, which is to show that he is standing up to Russia, but also trying in some ways to deliver on what he said in his own campaign for the presidency, which was, look, let's reset relations.
But as you say, this is about a forum that's about cooperation and collaboration, multilateralism, and Donald Trump is much more about winners and losers and individual nations. I mean, is this going to be seen to some extent, particularly in the light of him pulling the US out of the Paris Agreement on climate change? I mean, is he retiring the US from sort of global politics in that sense? Well,
that's the problem. In a way, Donald Trump's problem mirrors Theresa May's problem, as John was just saying there. Has Britain lost its clout on the global stage because of Brexit? That's one big question. And has Donald Trump, by virtue of being who he is and trying to retrench on things like globalisation, has he taken the US's own influence off the table? Obviously, the US is still a mighty nation. It's a hugely strong economic nation. So it's got a lot of clout still. The big problem is that on things like Iran, things like climate change, it looks as though the United States is being gently persuaded to come on board with everyone else. But whether or not Trump agrees to it is the big question.
All right, let's leave it there.
After months of claim and counterclaim, President Trump has had his first face-to-face meeting with a man accused of trying to rig the US presidential election, Russia's President Putin. The handshake was cordial and the words polite, and the rest of the talks, lasting 2 hours, took place behind closed doors. The two men are at the G20 meeting of world leaders in Hamburg. Our North America editor John Sopel reports from there.
It's hard to overstate the significance of this meeting, this handshake. Two men with nuclear arsenals who could blow the world to pieces. Two self-proclaimed tough guys who like to win. But today, at their first face-to-face meeting, they were the epitome of restraint and respect.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. President Putin and I have been discussing various things, and I think it's going very well. We've had some very, very good talks. We're going to have a talk now, and obviously that will continue. But we look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned. And it's an honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.
And for his part, Vladimir Putin said, "I am delighted to be able to meet you personally, Mr. President, and hope, as you have said, our meeting will yield positive results." But there's a cloud. Did Vladimir Putin's interference in the presidential election deliver victory to Donald Trump? US intelligence agencies have no doubt that Russian hacking did take place and that it must have been sanctioned by President Putin and was designed to help the Trump campaign. The American president, though, insists he won fair and square. And then there are the policy differences. Trump accused Russia of destabilizing Ukraine and other countries. Putin wants sanctions against Russia lifted. Trump wants to work with Russia in Syria to help defeat so-called Islamic State, but not while Russia is working with the Iranians and Syrian regime. And then there's the family photo, with President Trump in the strange position of not being centre stage. But forget any headline of President marginalised. It seemed there was no shortage of leaders wanting to bend his ear. And two big topics, one trade, the other climate change.
I was clear to President Trump at how disappointed the UK was that the United States had decided to pull out of the Paris Agreement, and also clear that I hope that they will be able to find a way to come back in to the Paris Agreement. I think that's important for us globally.
Is it possible?
As I believe it is possible. We're not renegotiating the Paris Agreement, that stays, but I want to see the United States looking for ways to rejoin it.
Climate change is one of the many issues of concern to the thousands of protesters seeking to disrupt the summit. Though forget global warming, some were getting a Hamburg police cool down. Though not entirely clear how effective the umbrellas were. But there have been ugly scenes of vandalism and clashes with police. Indeed, such has been the concern over security that the First Lady Melania Trump was ordered to stay put in her guest house and not venture out. Hamburg memorable then for who she didn't meet and who he did. Now, the meeting between the two men was meant to have lasted 30 minutes. It lasted the best part of 2.5 hours, which suggests that it was a really substantial meeting. President Putin has said they discussed Ukraine, they discussed Syria, they discussed terrorism, but they also discussed cybersecurity, raising the question that the issue of Russian interference in the American elections may well have been raised by Donald Trump. Fiona.
John Sopel in Hamburg, thank you.
Now, I'm in the giant conference centre in the centre of Hamburg, but the music you can hear behind me is actually Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which includes, of course, the European anthem, the Ode to Joy, currently being played at the city's futuristic Symphony Orchestra Hall. Now, there in attendance are the leaders of the G20 summit, and amongst them Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump, I don't think I've ever seen him look quite so happy as he did when he arrived in the concert hall. He had looked very grumpy for most of the day, but he looked very happy this evening, perhaps because he's had a 2-hour and 60-minute bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin. Finally, they got together face to face, and according to his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, they discussed a whole range of issues, from interference in the American election. Vladimir Putin denied it, but also said there would never be any interference from Russia ever again, and he expected the same from America in Russian affairs. They talked about Syria. There will be, according to them, a partial ceasefire in the southwest of the country as of the day after tomorrow. They talked about cyber security. They talked about North Korea. It seems to have been a very fruitful meeting. And finally, I have to say, Donald Trump seems to have found his feet, which one cannot always say is the case at these sort of international summits. However, the music in that hall might be sublime. The mood music on the streets has been utterly appalling. Watch my report of the day. Hamburg may think twice about hosting another global summit. Angela Merkel chose the city of her birth because of its trading history, its openness to the world, not its combustibility. Today it felt like a city under siege, caught in the pitched battle between protesters and police. This was the main avenue of one of the city's smartest neighborhoods. The neighbors hadn't expected to double up as their own fire brigade. If the current state of world politics is defined by a chasm of distrust between leaders and led, then this sort of stuff doesn't help. A mere Molotov cocktail's throw away, but on another planet, the hermetically sealed security bubble of the G20. Here the leader of the free world, as some now call her, was greeting the man whose job once came automatically with that title. President Trump's motorcade had been forced to take a detour by the protests. His wife Melania was marooned in their billet by the demonstrators. And at events like this, he still feels like the odd one out. All reasons perhaps to be miffed. Then there was Putin greets Merkel. The two first met in their teens at a Soviet summer camp in East Germany. He speaks fluent German, she speaks fluent Russian, but they've barely been on speaking terms since he annexed Crimea and she imposed sanctions on him. Spot the contrast with Emmanuel Macron, the new leader on the block, the Harry Potter of global politics who's found the secret source of instant success at the polls. It felt at times like a stilted edition of World's Got Talent, a leadership contest for an uncertain era. And there's a lot of uncertainty to tackle, from global terrorism to trade to climate change. Donald Trump has famously turned his back on the Paris Accord, although here he just missed the cue to swivel for the summit snap, until his friend Theresa May gently nudged him and he got out his best smile for the cameras.
Wir kennen alle die großen globalen Herausforderungen.
We all know the great global challenges, and we know that time is pressing. So solutions can only be found if we work towards a compromise without going through contortions. We need to acknowledge that there are differences between us. We do, after all, represent 2/3 of the world population and 3/4 of its trade and GDP.
Nuanced words lost on some of the hardcore audience outside the bubble, for whom globalization is a dirty word. For them, all summits are an occasion to vent. For the guests, this summit is an occasion for FaceTime, especially here, the first eyeball-to-eyeball of Presidents Trump and Putin, a relationship more debated than any other these days. Did he help him get elected? Did he offer the others something in return? On this issue hinges so much, including perhaps Mr. Trump's job. Will the handshake become an embrace or an arm wrestle? They were supposed to meet for half an hour. They ended up talking for almost 2.5 hours, agreeing, it seems, a ceasefire deal for southwest Syria. Promising perhaps, President Trump wasn't giving too much away as he arrived at Hamburg's futuristic concert hall with First Lady Melania. No peace on the streets outside the bubble, though. Another afternoon of clashes, and that sound you hear? It's not just tear gas and riot shields, but the sound of the world's diplomatic furniture being rearranged. Now here, of course, also the Prime Minister, Theresa May. She travelled for the first time to a global summit with her husband, the Prime Ministerial +1, Philip. They're currently at that concert as well, listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Now, she was trying to push initiatives like cybersecurity, her initiatives on terrorism, talk a lot about trade in various bilateral meetings, including with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. She's due to meet Donald Trump tomorrow morning. But she has been overshadowed, her visit has been overshadowed, also in the eyes of some of the leaders here, by events at home. The Grenfell fire tragedy and, of course, also the election, which didn't quite go according to plan. I asked her about all this earlier in the day. Listen. Let me start with a personal question. In the last month, you've lost your majority, you've lost your two closest aides, you've lost much of the respect of the British public after your response to the Grenfell tragedy. You must be absolutely full of regrets at the moment.
No. If we look at the general election, of course, the result didn't go in the way that I'd hoped for. But the government can take...
Do you regret that you ever went to the country?
I think it was the right decision to actually call that election.
With the wrong result?
I'd hoped for a different result. But the government can now take one of two approaches. We can sort of sit back and be very timid, or we can be bold, and that's what we're going to be, because there are some real challenges that the United Kingdom faces. Of course, we need to get Brexit right. We've started those negotiations. We'll be leaving the European Union, but we want to negotiate that comprehensive free trade agreement, a deep and special partnership with the EU for the future. But there are other issues I want to address as well. Some of those, of course, were set out in the Queen's speech, dealing with the issues of mental health that I think for too long in our country have not been put and given the importance that they deserve.
We'll get onto those issues in a minute, but what the British public wants to know is that you have a soul, that there's emotion there, because your response to the Grenfell tragedy, one of the biggest tragedies to have befallen the country for a long time, was lacking in terms of emotion and soul and response.
What was important in responding to the Grenfell fire tragedy, which was an absolutely awful tragedy, and sadly, as we know, many people lost their lives and others lost everything that they had. What was important in that response was to ensure, first of all, that our emergency services had everything they needed to respond, but then to listen to the residents, which I have done, to listen to the victims of the fire, which I have done, to listen to the residents of the area, to listen to the victims, to hear what their needs were. They gave me a very clear message that the Council's response was not good enough. That's why the government has acted. It's why the government has ensured that we've put people in to be able to help those residents, why we're providing funding for those residents, why we've offered residents rehousing. We gave a commitment to do that, and we've done that, and will now be supporting in the offering of permanent accommodation for the people who were the victims of this terrible and awful tragedy.
So when your critics call you robotic in your style, and much of the public calls you heartless, have they just misunderstood you?
I think what's important is that we get on with the job, and getting on with the job is about delivering for people. That's why I put a focus on listening to residents from Grenfell Tower and the surrounding area and responding to the issues that they were raising, and government has done that, and we continue to do that. It's why I think it's important that I've put a judge-led inquiry into place that is going to get to the bottom of what happened, because what people want is not just an opportunity to rebuild their lives, but if they're going to rebuild their lives, they need to know what went wrong and to know that those who are responsible are being held to account. And that's what I'm doing. I heard some amazing stories from people. You know, the woman who ran out of her flat in just sort of a t-shirt and knickers, losing absolutely everything. And we owe it to them to make sure that we get to the bottom of what happened, find out who was responsible and hold them accountable.
But you turn up at this summit here a diminished leader, don't you? And if you look at the German papers or the French papers or the Italian papers, the European press thinks that we're a laughingstock. And it's partly as a result of how we're handling Brexit negotiations. It's partly as a result of the chaos at the heart of government, the perceived chaos at the heart of government in London, and partly as a result of an election that wasn't necessary, where you didn't end up with a majority.
What we're doing in the Brexit negotiations, and those have started constructively, is focusing, as I always said, up front on one of the key issues, which is the offer for citizens, EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in Europe. We've made what is not just a fair and serious offer, but I believe a generous offer to EU citizens living in the UK, and I expect that to be reciprocated for those British citizens.
But we're not being taken as seriously as we were, Prime Minister. We're not being taken as seriously as we were.
We are in serious negotiations with the European Union. We are continuing to play our role on the world stage. That's why I'm here at the G20. That's why I will be one of the leading voices on issues around counter-terrorism, encouraging the international community to deal with the issues of terrorist financing. It's why I will be continuing to promote the ideals of global free trade, which we believe is about jobs and
who
prosperity.
will listen to you here? Who will listen to you here and take you seriously?
Well, 19 countries sitting around the table will be listening and will be taking us seriously and will be working with us. As we've already seen, if you look at what happened at the G7, it was the United Kingdom who led on the counter-terrorism issues there. An agreement came from around that table to what the United Kingdom was proposing. So we will be leading on discussions here, particularly on counter-terrorism, and working with the international community, because we all face this threat of terrorism and we need to work together to defeat it.
Prime Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister Theresa May speaking to me earlier in the day, and just as well for her that Donald Trump seemed to be in a very good mood tonight as he went to that concert in the Hamburg Philharmonic Concert Hall, because he'd spent 2.5 hours, almost 2.5 hours with Vladimir Putin. They discussed a whole range of issues, including cybersecurity, terrorism, Syria, where they seem to have fashioned some kind of ceasefire. They talked about Ukraine, they talked about North Korea, and apparently Mr. Trump is much less belligerent this time than he has been in the past. In the last few weeks, he said that they want to get the North Koreans to the negotiating table, so that's an interesting development as well. In fact, they were getting on so well with each other that at one stage the First Lady, Melania Trump, went into the room and tried to get them to stop their meeting because they had to go to this concert that's going on right now, and they both said, no, hang on, we're going to carry on talking, just leave us alone. And so they did for another 45 minutes. This is good because Theresa May is meeting Trump tomorrow morning, so that's a very important bilateral meeting as well. We'll see what happens with that. This is of course essential because she wants to be at the front of the queue for a trade deal with the United States after Brexit. That seems to have been kicked slightly into the long grass somewhat. He hasn't come on his state visit for various reasons. That's also in the long grass. So in other words, everything to play for tomorrow at the summit here in Hamburg. Back to you in London, Kathy.
Thanks, Matt. Love to be a fly on the wall on that meeting.
Few political encounters have been quite so hotly anticipated as the one which took place in Hamburg this afternoon, the moment when President Trump and President Putin finally came face to face. Allegations of Russian interference in the US election, deep divisions over Syria, North Korea and climate change could hardly have provided a more perilous backdrop. But from the handshakes, smiles and warm words, you might never have guessed it. Mr. Trump did, however, waste no time in asking his counterpart if he'd interfered in his election.
Rushing in late for the evening's entertainment in Hamburg's spectacular new concert hall, President Trump and First Lady Melania, delayed by talks with President Putin that overran by almost 2 hours. Hot on his heels, Putin himself barely into his evening wear, a ceasefire agreement in southwest Syria in his pocket, and much more important, an apparent commitment from Donald Trump himself to leave Russia's past misbehavior behind them and look to the future. In their first face-to-face meeting, Trump had looked more relaxed with Putin than he had with any of his fellow leaders. There were none of the macho games with the handshake that have become so familiar, just warm words and high expectations.
We're going to have a talk now, and obviously that will continue. But we look forward to a lot of very positive things happening for Russia, for the United States, and for everybody concerned.
Soon afterwards, and off camera, the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson gave his account of the meeting, of how Trump demanded to know whether the Russians had hacked the US election, but then accepted Putin's denials.
The president at this point, he pressed him and then, felt like at this point, let's talk about how do we go forward. There was not a lot of relitigating of the past. I think both of the leaders feel like there's a lot of things in the past that both of us are unhappy about.
Back in the conference room, the steady decline of British influence post the Brexit vote was beginning to show itself. Divorcing from Europe, the new relationship with Donald Trump proving trickier than expected, Theresa May cut a lonely figure as she prepared for the family photo.
but we're also playing our full part on the world stage, as I will be doing here at the G20.
But William Hague, your former colleague, a man who knows a bit about trying to exert British influence abroad, says that it is bound to decline with our exit from the European Union. That's true, isn't it?
What I see when I talk to leaders from around the world is a genuine interest in working with Britain in the future, a Britain that will be outside the European Union.
Once so proud of their role as the bridge between Europe and America, British diplomats are finding that bridges don't work so well when uprooted from one side of the divide. There was one visible contribution today as Angela Merkel asked her fellow leaders to turn around for the cameras. President Trump's unmistakable rear view was resolutely not for turning. A gentle nudge from Mrs. May was required to bring the president back into the moment. By the time they were ready to sit down to dinner late this evening, the president will have felt well pleased with his day's work, even if many back in Washington may have serious concerns about where he and his new friend Putin are taking them. James Mates, News at 10, Hamburg.
Well, while the world's leaders wrestled with questions of global security inside the summit, the streets outside witnessed more ugly scenes of confrontation. For the second day in succession, hundreds of anti-capitalist protesters fought violent battles with German riot police.
From first thing this morning, there were running riots through the streets of Hamburg. What had started as a peaceful protest, descending into chaos as police chased and battered protesters, ripping their scars from their faces. The situation escalated quickly, and soon pockets of violence were erupting across the city. Smoke was seen rising as cars were set on fire. Anti-capitalist protesters determined to cause maximum disruption and destruction. What then ensued was a large-scale game of cat and mouse. Water cannons were fired in an attempt to quash the crowd. But in return, bottles, bricks and fireworks were thrown at the riot police. All day, battles have been raging between the two sides.
As the day has gone on, the police have become increasingly aggressive and the protesters more determined, leading to a rise in the number and the intensity of the clashes.
Much of the anger is being directed at the police. They have been accused of sparking the violence with their heavy-handed tactics. If the plan was to contain the trouble and minimise disorder during this G20 summit, then it appears to have failed. As the fighting continues tonight, there's the promise of more tomorrow. Debbie Edward, News at 10, Hamburg.
Well, away from those terrible scenes, James Mates is outside the summit for us tonight. And James, this meeting between Trump and Putin was talked of as a chance to reset that relationship between US and Russia. Did it achieve that, in your view?
Well, you know, we've been here before. George W. Bush, who at his first meeting said, I looked into his eyes, saw into his soul and found him trustworthy. His successor, Barack Obama, then actually presents President Putin with a red button with the word reset on it to symbolize another start, and that didn't go too well either. I mean, this, in theory, should go better. I mean, there were no lectures on democracy, which Putin so hates, from Donald Trump. That was all about deal-making. But remember, I mean, there's history here. Russia is accused of interfering in a sacred US election. A national security advisor has already had to resign because of his links to Trump. There are sanctions imposed by the US Congress on Russia because of its occupation of Crimea and interference in eastern Ukraine, which is not at all clear that Donald Trump could lift even if he wanted to. Plus these major investigations going on into links between the Trump campaign and Moscow. It's not easy to see how, if any of that comes to anything substantial, that this relationship could really take off.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed for that.
Well, so much has been written about Trump and Russia, it's hard to believe that President Trump and Vladimir Putin only met for the first time today. Now, a lot's been written about Trump and handshakes, the non-shake with Angela Merkel, the firm grip of Emmanuel Macron. But here is the footage of the one that really matters, Trump and Putin. This is the official handshake. Some commented that Putin cleverly got Trump to reach out to him. Personally, I'd say it's pretty uneventful. There was also an earlier encounter. This was actually not for the media, but it was filmed on a mobile. Again, you can probably read something into it if you choose to. Well, that was the body language, but what about the substance? The two presidents did actually meet for longer than expected, 2 hours and 20 minutes. Some wondered whether some kind of major announcement might come out of it. Peace in Syria, a deal on Ukraine. Nothing that dramatic. But Mark Urban, our diplomatic editor, is with me to tell us what did emerge. What did come out of it, Mark?
Well, look, they did come to an agreement about a ceasefire in southern Syria, deconfliction. US and Russian forces have been getting close to potential combat there. I guess that's a positive tick. Also to appoint an American representative to the Ukraine peace process, the so-called Minsk process. Once again, a bit of forward movement there. They were frank about the fact they couldn't agree on the way ahead with North Korea, that Russia was not keen to join sanctions on North Korea. But of course, look, everyone wanted to know what would happen when President Trump tabled this issue of hacking and the elections, and of course what the US intelligence community says is clear Russian state-sponsored meddling in their election. And the Americans say they put that right out there to start with. The Russian version of what happened, I think you spotted that Sergei Lavrov, when telling reporters about it afterwards, said that they assured him the Russian leadership hadn't ordered such a thing, which was a curious form of words, which chimes in with some things President Putin has said, implying it might have come from Russia.
Maybe someone else had, but not the leadership.
So, frankly, the American attitude was pretty much, look, can we move on? And that was expressed by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
What the two presidents, I think rightly, focused on is how do we move forward? How do we move forward from here? Because it's not clear to me that we will ever come to some agreed upon resolution of that question between the two nations. So the question is, what do we do now?
OK, so Tillerson there in that recorded clip saying we need to just think about other things. Did they make
well, a lot of people obviously in the US will be unhappy about that. You know, I mean, just let's move on sort of thing.
Yeah, but in terms of the sort of reset that had been thought about, anything?
Well, of course, you know, he campaigned on this. President Trump can say, look, I promised better relations with Russia. I've got to deliver it. Now let's crack on and get on with it. A lot of people think, oh, is he sensitive about the way this would be received? You know, the narrative that he's Putin's pawn, all that sort of stuff, which is popular, of course, among his enemies. Others say, well, no, actually, he doesn't care what they think. But there is another problem, which is who actually shares his objective, particularly on things like sanctions, of rolling them back and helping President Putin in that sense, building this stronger relationship. Here's former Secretary of State official Jeremy Shapiro.
He has no one in his own government who shares his opinion of Russia and Vladimir Putin. For whatever reason, he didn't appoint anybody who could do that for him. And this is why so frequently we see him saying something about NATO, for example, and the next day one of his cabinet members comes out and says, pay no attention to what the President of the United States said, that's not our policy.
Joe Shapiro there. Mark, thank you very much. We'll follow the G20 and everything more in the next few days. Thanks a lot.